The brutal secret that made the Mongols unstoppable. The project overview them. Narrative explores how survival strategies refined over centuries allowed a nomadic people to create history's largest empire, and how the very comfort of that success ultimately destroyed it. Pause, subscribe, and like our channel for more videos. Story 1. The Blood Empire, how Mongol warriors conquered through survival. And the problem that changed everything. Let me take you back. Not to a specific year, but to a specific moment in human history when everything changed, though nobody at the time realized it was happening. Imagine you are living in medieval Europe. It's the year 1230. You are a soldier in the army of Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire. Your king has declared war on a neighboring kingdom, and you have been conscripted to march with 15,000 other soldiers across the landscape toward an enemy that waits somewhere beyond the horizon. Before you leave, your commanders gather you and the other soldiers. They explain the logistics, the supplies, the plan. You will march approximately 15 miles per day, no more. The reason is simple. An army cannot move faster than its supply line allows it to move. Behind your 15,000 soldiers there are thousands of wagons. These wagons carry grain, flour, salted meat, vegetables that will last through the winter, ale, water, rope, tools, everything an army needs to survive. To feed 15,000 men per day requires approximately 300,000 pounds of food and water. That is the equivalent of about 200 wagons pulled by oxen, moving at the pace of walking men. These 200 wagons require drivers, probably another 300 men. Those 300 drivers need to eat too, so the supply line grows. Now you need more wagons to feed the wagon drivers. Now you need more drivers to drive those wagons. By the time you have calculated everyone and everything needed to sustain this army, you have effectively doubled the number of people who need to be fed, clothed, and cared for. Your army of 15,000 combat soldiers becomes an army of 30,000 total people, half of whom are not fighters but support staff, cooks, blacksmiths, wagon makers, logistics officers, supply managers, physicians, engineers. And still, if something goes wrong, if a harvest fails, if wagons break down, if roads become impassable, your entire army grinds to a halt. Soldiers become hungry. Hungry soldiers become weak. Weak soldiers become defeated soldiers. This was the reality of medieval warfare. Every army in the known world operated under this same constraint. The Crusaders marching toward Jerusalem struggled with these logistics. The armies of the Islamic caliphates dealt with the same problem. The Chinese dynasties that controlled the Silk Road faced identical challenges. No matter how strong your warriors were, no matter how skilled your generals were, no matter how much courage your soldiers possessed, none of it mattered if you couldn't feed them. This was the fundamental problem of war, and it had been this way for thousands of years. Now let me shift your attention to something happening on the other side of the world. In the vast grasslands of Central Asia, a region we call the Eurasian steppe, something different was developing. These were not the organized kingdoms of Europe. There were no castles here, no permanent cities, no established nations with borders and bureaucracies. Instead, the Eurasian steppe was home to dozens of nomadic tribes. These tribes, the Mongols, the Tatars, the Karaites, the Naimans, were constantly moving, constantly at war with each other, constantly struggling to survive. These were not civilized peoples by European standards. They had no writing system at first, no permanent settlements, no agriculture. They lived entirely by herding animals, mostly horses, some sheep, some goats, and following them across the endless grasslands. To an educated European observer of the year 1200, these people would have seemed primitive, uncivilized, almost subhuman. And yet, within a single century, these steppe nomads would conquer more territory than the Roman Empire had conquered in 500 years. They would do this not with superior technology, not with better weapons. The swords and bows of the Mongols were not fundamentally different from the weapons used by European or Chinese armies. They would do this by solving a problem that seemed unsolvable. They figured out how to feed an army without wagons, how to move an army 100 miles in a single day while other armies could only move 15 miles, how to sustain warriors in the harshest environments on Earth, deserts, mountains, frozen wastelands where other armies would simply collapse. And the secret was so simple, so brutal, so contrary to everything civilized societies believed about warfare, that when European observers first encountered it, many of them refused to believe it was real. You see, a Mongol warrior did not carry food in wagons. A Mongol warrior carried his food on his back, and sometimes if the food ran out, he carried his food inside his horse. This is where the story begins. Not with grand battles or famous generals, but with a question of basic survival that forced one group of people to discover something that would reshape the entire world. How do you feed an army when you cannot carry food? How do you move faster than every other army in the world? How do you maintain strength and discipline when you are constantly hungry and constantly moving? A Mongol warrior knew the answer because for hundreds of years his ancestors had been forced to discover it. Living on the Eurasian steppe was not a choice. It was a consequence of geography and circumstance. The steppe provides little: no forests for fuel, few animals to hunt, no permanent water sources in many regions. A person could die on the steppe from thirst within a day or two. Cold could kill you in a night. Hunger was a constant companion. To survive, the nomadic peoples of Central Asia developed a way of life that was entirely different from anything in Europe. They moved constantly following grazing animals. They lived off milk and meat and blood. They built no permanent structures. They created no permanent supply lines. They were, by necessity, self-sufficient. A nomadic warrior on the steppe could survive in conditions where a European soldier would simply perish. But more importantly, they had developed a system, a way of organizing their survival, a method of moving, feeding, and sustaining themselves that made them, in a very real sense, unstoppable once they decided to expand beyond their grasslands. The question that emerges from this comparison is not just a matter of military history. It is a question about human adaptation, about what happens when people are forced by their environment to rethink everything about how they survive, about what advantages desperation can create. What would happen if these nomadic warriors, with their centuries of survival expertise, their knowledge of how to feed themselves without infrastructure, their ability to move faster than any army in the world, suddenly unified? What would happen if one man, a ruthless man with a vision, figured out how to take these scattered tribes and turn them into a single coherent force? That man was coming. His name was Temujin. The world would come to know him by another name, Genghis Khan. And the story of what he would build, and how he would build it, begins with understanding one simple truth. Warfare is not won on the battlefield. Warfare is won in the supply lines. The survival system, now that we understand the fundamental problem, how to feed an army without an infrastructure-dependent supply line, we can begin to explore the radical solution that the Mongols developed. And it begins, as many revolutionary ideas do, with a very simple observation about the world. A Mongol warrior, riding across the Eurasian steppe in the year 1200, carried almost nothing. When European armies traveled, they moved with thousands of wagons. When Chinese armies marched, they required a complex system of supply depots and logistical hubs. A Mongol warrior carried a bow, a quiver of arrows, a saddlebag containing perhaps 10 pounds of dried meat, maybe some leather armor, a knife. That was essentially it. Everything else? He obtained it from his immediate environment or from his horse. The horse was not merely a means of transportation. The horse was a living supply line. The horse was a survival kit. The horse was a weapon. The horse was, in the most literal sense, a Mongol warrior's only real asset. Let's talk about what this meant in practice. A Mongol warrior could ride up to 80 miles in a single day. When he arrived at his destination, he would be tired, but he would not be starving. Why? Because during those 80 miles, he could stop and care for his horse. And in caring for his horse, he could feed himself. This is where the practice that so horrified European observers comes into play. When a Mongol warrior needed food, he would approach his horse. Using a knife with practiced precision, he would make a small incision in the horse's neck, carefully, deliberately, in a way that would not permanently damage the animal. Blood would flow. He would collect perhaps 1 to 2 liters of blood in a leather container or a bowl. Then, crucially, he would immediately seal the wound. The blood would clot. The horse would survive. The warrior would drink the blood, warm, protein-rich, sustaining. The next day or several days later, he could repeat the process. A healthy horse could sustain this practice multiple times before needing an extended rest period. To a Mongol warrior, this was normal, practical, necessary. To a European knight or a Chinese general, this practice seemed barbaric, inhuman, impossible. Yet this single practice, this one adaptation to the harsh realities of steppe survival, gave the Mongols an advantage that no other army in the world could match. But the survival system was far more sophisticated than just drinking horse blood. A Mongol warrior also drank mare's milk. On the steppe there were herds of wild animals that could be hunted: deer, gazelle, wild boar. A skilled hunter could kill an animal and prepare meat that could be dried and preserved for months. 3. Mongols also understood something about nutrition that civilized societies were only beginning to comprehend. A warrior could survive on surprisingly small amounts of food if that food was nutrient-dense. Blood and meat provided protein and fat. Dried meat required no cooking, which meant no campfires. And no campfires meant no smoke to alert enemies of your position. Even their armor was designed with survival in mind. Mongol armor was made primarily from leather and layered cloth, not the heavy steel that European knights wore. This armor could be boiled to create a nutritious broth if the warrior was truly starving. It was lighter, which meant a warrior could ride longer distances without exhausting his horse. And it was flexible enough to allow for rapid movement and archery. Now let's think about what this system actually accomplished. A European army, with 50,000 soldiers, required another 50,000 support personnel to keep them fed and equipped. That army could move perhaps 15 miles per day. The supply lines were vulnerable to attack. If an enemy disrupted the supply trains, the entire army collapsed. A Mongol army with 50,000 warriors required almost no support personnel. Each warrior brought 2 to 3 extra horses with him. These extra horses served multiple purposes. If one horse grew too weak from blood loss or excessive riding, the warrior could switch to a fresh horse. The extra horses also provided additional mobile food supply. In a pinch, a Mongol warrior could eat his horse. Not that he preferred to. The horse was more valuable alive. But if starvation was the alternative, an army of 50,000 Mongols would never actually go hungry. That same Mongol army could cover 100 miles in a day. Their supply line didn't exist as a vulnerable chain of wagons and depots. Their supply line moved with them, on hooves, integrated into the army itself. More importantly, this system meant that a Mongol army could operate in environments where other armies simply could not exist. In deserts where no permanent settlement supplied water, Mongol warriors could survive. In mountains where supply lines could not function, Mongol armies climbed where others could not follow. In frozen wastelands, Mongol warriors endured. This wasn't just about food. This was about psychology. A European soldier in a medieval army was dependent. A Mongol warrior was independent. He could survive on his horse and his skills. He could endure hunger. He could push through exhaustion. A Mongol warrior understood from childhood that he would never be truly safe, never be truly comfortable, but that he could survive. And that confidence, that psychological certainty that you could survive in conditions that would kill others, was a weapon every bit as powerful as a sword or a bow. But there was another aspect to the Mongol survival system: training and discipline. Every Mongol warrior from the time he was a small child learned to ride. By age 5 or 6, a Mongol child was already spending hours on horseback. By age 10, he could hunt for days alone without adult supervision. By age 15, he was an accomplished warrior. A young Mongol learned to ride in all weather, in rain, in snow, in wind that made it almost impossible to stay upright in a saddle. He learned to shoot arrows from a galloping horse while maintaining balance. He learned to survive on minimal food for extended periods. He learned to sleep in a saddle while riding through the night. By the time he became a warrior, a Mongol didn't just know these skills. They were instinct. They were second nature. This is the point at which we must ask a question that will ultimately lead us to understand not just how the Mongols conquered their world, but why they would eventually lose it. If the Mongol system was so effective, so perfectly adapted to warfare and survival, how did this system even develop in the first place? The answer lies in understanding that the Mongol survival system wasn't invented. It evolved. It evolved because the Eurasian steppe left no alternative. Survival there required adaptation or death. The practices that seemed so barbaric and inhuman to outsiders weren't cultural preferences. They were responses to necessity. But necessity, if you survive it long enough, becomes culture. It becomes identity. It becomes the normal way of doing things. And when people are united by a common culture of survival, when they understand themselves as a warrior people, as a people who have conquered hardship through adaptation and discipline, you create something powerful. You create warriors. But the system that created these warriors also had a hidden fragility. The system depended on continued hardship. It depended on people understanding viscerally and daily that comfort was impossible, that safety was an illusion, that the only way to survive was to be tough, disciplined, and ready to endure. But what happens to this system when it succeeds? What happens when the scattered tribes of the steppe are unified under a single leader? What happens when they begin conquering cities and empires? What happens when victory after victory brings wealth and power and the ability to build permanent settlements? What happens when the system that created warriors is finally replaced by the comfort of civilization? The first conquest is around the year 1180. The Eurasian steppe is fragmented as it has been for centuries. Dozens of nomadic tribes roam the grasslands, each led by their own Khan, each fiercely protective of their territory and their herds. There is no unity. There is no common government. There is only a constant low-level warfare, raids, counter-raids, feuds that span generations. Into this fractured world is born a boy. We don't know his exact birth date. We know he was born into the Borjigin tribe. His father was murdered when he was young. His mother struggled to keep the family alive in a world where vulnerability meant death. The boy's name was Temujin. Temujin's early life was brutal. He was a slave. He was a fugitive. He lost family members to violence and starvation. Every day on the steppe tested him. Every day proved whether he was capable of surviving in a world that valued strength and ruthlessness above all else. But Temujin possessed something rare: ambition combined with intelligence. He began to gather followers, not through magic, not through divine intervention, through a simple realization. The constant warfare between the tribes was weakening all of them. A unified steppe could achieve things that fragmented tribes could never achieve. Temujin used the survival system we've just explored, the system that had been refined over hundreds of years by the nomadic peoples, not as a way to simply endure, but as a way to create an organized military force. He reorganized tribal warfare into something more systematic. He broke down tribal hierarchies. He promoted men based on merit rather than birth. He created a military structure where commanders answered directly to him, where loyalty to Temujin superseded tribal loyalty. And he did something that previous steppe leaders had never managed. He unified. By 1206, after decades of military campaigns, political maneuvering, and brutal consolidation of power, Temujin had unified the scattered tribes of the Eurasian steppe into a single cohesive force. In that year, he took a new title, Genghis Khan. The title means universal ruler. Now Genghis Khan commanded perhaps 50,000 to 100,000 warriors. These were not soldiers in the European sense. They weren't professional warriors with formal training. Instead, they were tribespeople who had been warriors their entire lives. They knew how to ride. They knew how to fight. They knew how to survive on horse blood and dried meat. They knew the steppe like Europeans knew their villages. But now, these warriors were unified. They had a single leader. They had a command structure. They had discipline. And now, with this unified force, they began to expand. First, they moved against the settled kingdom surrounding the steppe. The Jin dynasty in China was weakened by internal conflicts. The Islamic states to the west of the steppe were fragmented. The Europeans had no idea that a threat was coming from the distant east. When Mongol armies first appeared on the horizon of settled civilizations, the response was confusion, and soon after, horror. A Persian chronicler wrote of the first Mongol invasion. They came from the north like a plague of locusts. They moved faster than any riders we had ever seen. They appeared, they attacked, and before we could respond, they were gone. We didn't understand how they sustained themselves. We didn't understand how they could move so quickly. The answer, of course, was the survival system. The Mongols could move quickly because they didn't need supply lines. They could appear anywhere because they needed minimal infrastructure. They could operate in deserts and mountains and frozen wastelands because they had been trained their entire lives to survive in those conditions. Imagine for a moment the perspective of a settled civilization facing Mongol invasion for the first time. You are a general in the Jin dynasty of China. Your scouts report that an army has crossed the border. You organize your forces. You begin moving your supply lines to the frontier. You calculate how long it will take you to mobilize to move your armies into position, to prepare for a proper siege. But while you're doing all of this, the Mongol army is already at your gates. They moved 200 miles while you were still preparing your supply lines. They attacked your frontier settlements. They conquered 3 provinces while you were still organizing your response. This asymmetry, the difference between an army that required complex infrastructure and an army that moved like the wind, was the fundamental advantage the Mongols possessed. Within a generation, Mongol armies had conquered northern China. Within 2 generations, they had taken southern China. They swept west, conquering the Islamic states. They pushed into Europe. They threatened Vienna. They sent armies into the Middle East. They conquered so much territory so quickly that later historians could barely comprehend the speed of the conquest. The Mongol Empire, at its peak, stretched from Korea in the east to Poland in the west, from Russia in the north to Cambodia in the south. It was the largest contiguous empire in human history, and it was built on the survival system we've described, on the ability to move faster than enemies expected, on the willingness of warriors to endure hardship, on the discipline that comes from a culture where comfort is alien and survival is the only certainty. But there is a crucial point we need to emphasize, because it will become central to understanding the eventual decline of Mongol power. The Mongols didn't conquer the world through some revolutionary new technology. They didn't invent a new type of weapon. They didn't suddenly become smarter or stronger than everyone else. They conquered the world by being the only people who had adapted to survive under conditions that would destroy other armies. They conquered the world because they had a system, refined over centuries, for operating without the infrastructure that all other civilizations required. In other words, they conquered the world by being better at hardship. But what happens when hardship ends? What happens when Mongol warriors, after decades of conquest, finally settle down? When they take cities for themselves? When they build palaces? When they transition from being warriors into being rulers? What happens to a culture based on survival when survival is no longer a pressing concern? These questions would define the next chapter of Mongol history, and they would reveal something profound about the nature of power. That the qualities that create empires are often fundamentally opposed to the qualities that maintain empires. The Mongols would discover this truth in a way that no empire had discovered it before. They would conquer more territory than any empire in history, and then over the course of a few generations they would lose virtually all of it, not to external enemies, not to a superior force, to themselves, to the very comfort that they had fought so hard to achieve, to the softness that replaced the hardness that made them unstoppable. Boink. Subscribe and like our channel for more. Video Story 2. The Rise of Genghis Khan from Fragmented Tribes to Unified Dominion. The boy who lost everything. Temujin was born around 1162, though we have no precise date. He was born into the Borjigin, a minor tribe among the dozens of Mongol tribes that roamed the Eurasian steppe. His father was named Yesugei, a minor tribal leader of middling importance. Nothing about Temujin's birth suggested that he would one day unite an empire or reshape the world. When Temujin was about 9 years old, his life changed completely. His father was poisoned by a rival tribe, an act of tribal revenge that was commonplace on the steppe. With the death of Yesugei, the Borjigin tribe abandoned Temujin's family. A tribe without a strong leader was vulnerable, and Temujin's mother and siblings were no longer assets to the community. They were liabilities. For the next several years, Temujin's family lived on the margins of tribal life. They survived by scavenging, by hunting, by any means necessary. Temujin's younger brother died in a conflict with a rival group. His sister was abducted. His betrothed was captured by an enemy tribe. A devastating loss because marriages on the steppe were carefully arranged economic and political transactions. By his mid-teens, Temujin had experienced more suffering and loss than most people experience in an entire lifetime. And yet these experiences forged something in him, a determination to never again be vulnerable, a drive to build something that could not be destroyed. A vision of unity that could protect his family and his people from the endless cycles of raiding and revenge that defined steppe life. Around age 16, Temujin was captured by a rival tribe and enslaved. He was marked as an enslaved person with a wooden collar. He could have died in captivity. The steppe was unforgiving, and the fate of slaves was often brief and brutal. But Temujin escaped. He fled into the grasslands and managed to make his way back to his family. This escape became known among the tribes. It demonstrated that Temujin was resourceful, that he could survive in conditions that would kill ordinary people, that he possessed qualities that other young men on the steppe did not possess. Gradually, warriors began to gather around him, not because of his tribe's power. The Borjigin had no power. Not because of his wealth, Temujin had nothing, but because of who he was as a person. capable, intelligent, and determined to achieve something great. And crucially, because of a simple idea that would define Temujin's rise to power: meritocracy. Unlike other tribal leaders who promoted warriors based on birth and lineage, Temujin promoted based on ability and loyalty. If a warrior was skilled, if he was brave, if he was loyal to Temujin's vision, he could advance regardless of his tribal background or social status. This was revolutionary on the steppe. In a society organized entirely around tribal hierarchy, the idea that a man could rise through merit rather than birth was radical. It attracted warriors from throughout the steppe, men who were ambitious, who were talented, who had been passed over by their own tribes because they lacked high birth. But Temujin's vision extended beyond just organizing warriors. He looked at the steppe and saw something others could not see: that the constant warfare between tribes was making all of them weaker, that a unified steppe could have power that no fragmented tribe could ever possess, that the survival skills and military capabilities of steppe warriors, if organized and unified, could conquer empires. Over the course of 30 years, from around 1178 to 1206, Temujin fought his way to control of the steppe. He made alliances with tribes that recognized his vision. He defeated tribes that resisted. He executed leaders who refused to bend to his authority. He showed mercy to those who surrendered, but ruthlessness to those who opposed him. He was not a kind man, and he was not a good man by the moral standards of any civilization, but he was effective. By 1206, through a combination of military victories, political alliances, and brutal consolidation, Temujin had unified the tribes of the Eurasian steppe. In that year, a great assembly of the unified tribes was held. Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. It was not a title handed down from heaven, though Temujin would later present it as such. It was a title that he had fought for, bled for, and earned through decades of war and political maneuvering. At the age of perhaps 44, Temujin had achieved what no steppe leader before him had achieved. He had united his people, and now with the strength of a unified steppe behind him, he was ready to expand beyond the grasslands. He was ready to conquer the world. But to understand how he would do this, we must understand not just his military genius, but his strategic vision. Genghis Khan understood something that most rulers did not understand: that military victory was only the beginning, that true power required organization, administration, and a system of governance that could function across vast distances. Section 2. Building an empire. Once Genghis Khan had unified the tribes of the Eurasian steppe, his armies turned toward the settled civilizations that surrounded them. To the south lay the Jin dynasty of China, weakened by centuries of internal struggle. To the west lay the Islamic states, the Khwarezmian Empire, and other kingdoms. To the east lay Korea and other Asian states. To the west lay territories that would eventually lead to Europe. The conquered territories were vast, and they were populated by peoples with very different cultures, languages, and traditions from the Mongols. Genghis Khan faced a problem that had confronted every nomadic conqueror before him. How do you hold conquered territories? How do you prevent rebellions? How do you integrate diverse peoples under a single rule? Genghis Khan's solution was revolutionary for his time. He created an administrative system that could function across vast distances. He appointed governors and officials, many of whom were not Mongols. He valued competence and results over ethnicity or background. He created a postal system that allowed information to travel quickly across the empire. He standardized weights and measures. He established a legal code, the Yasa, that applied to all peoples under Mongol rule. Importantly, Genghis Khan was pragmatic about religion and culture. He did not attempt to force all conquered peoples to become Mongol. He did not demand that they speak the Mongol language or abandon their traditions. Instead, he demanded loyalty, the payment of taxes and military service. As long as these demands were met, conquered peoples were largely left alone to live according to their own traditions. This pragmatism was actually a military strategy. By being tolerant of local religions and cultures, Genghis Khan reduced resistance to Mongol rule. Many peoples who were conquered by the Mongols discovered that Mongol rule was actually less oppressive than the rule of their previous overlords. Taxes were actually lower under the Mongols in many regions. Trade flourished because the Mongols, for the first time, created a unified political space that stretched across Asia. The Mongol Empire became the first truly transcontinental political entity in world history. It connected East Asia with Central Asia, with the Islamic world, and eventually with Europe. Merchants could travel from China to Europe under the protection of Mongol law. Ideas, technologies, and goods flowed across the empire in ways they never had before. But this expansion came with a cost. Genghis Khan was ruthless toward any resistance. When a city refused to surrender, Mongol armies would conquer it and execute most of the population. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake, it was a strategic choice. By demonstrating that resistance was futile, Genghis Khan convinced other cities to surrender without a fight. One massacre prevented hundreds of battles. The result was a paradox. The Mongol Empire was simultaneously one of the most brutal and most peaceful political entities in history. It was brutal in how it conquered. It was peaceful in how it ruled. Cities that surrendered were treated far better than cities that resisted. Merchants could travel safely. Trade flourished. And the survival skills that had allowed Mongol warriors to dominate on the steppe were adapted to create an empire that could control settlements and cities. Genghis Khan also recognized something that other military leaders had not fully grasped: the importance of intelligence and spies. The Mongol Empire maintained a network of spies throughout the lands they controlled, and even in lands they had not yet conquered. This network allowed the central government to know what was happening in distant provinces. It allowed them to anticipate rebellion before it occurred. It allowed them to understand the capabilities and intentions of potential enemies. By the time of Genghis Khan's death in 1227, the Mongol Empire stretched from Korea in the east to the Caspian Sea in the west, an empire of unprecedented size. It was not the largest empire in history in absolute terms, but it was an empire of staggering complexity. It incorporated peoples with fundamentally different technologies, religions, languages, and cultures, and yet it functioned. It was governed. It was connected. But as large as Genghis Khan's empire was, it would grow even larger after his death. His successors continued the expansion, conquering the rest of China, much of the Islamic world, and pressing into Europe. Within 50 years of Genghis Khan's unification of the tribes, the Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous land empire in history. It would hold this distinction for centuries. What made this expansion possible was the military system that Genghis Khan developed. Unlike medieval European armies, which were organized around individual knights and vassals, Mongol armies were organized as cohesive units with strict discipline and clear chains of command. Unlike Chinese armies, which often relied on fortifications and defensive strategies, Mongol armies were mobile and aggressive. They could move quickly. They could concentrate their forces rapidly. They could adapt to different types of terrain and different types of enemies. The Mongol military system was also highly innovative in its use of siege weapons. While Mongol warriors themselves relied on traditional steppe tactics, rapid cavalry charges, archery, mobility, when attacking fortified cities, they employed siege weapons. They learned from Chinese engineers. They adapted technologies from conquered peoples. They incorporated the best military practices they encountered into their own system. This adaptability, the willingness to learn from others, to incorporate new technologies and strategies, to evolve their military system, was key to Mongol success. They were not hidebound traditionalists. They were pragmatists who understood that military effectiveness mattered more than preserving traditional ways of fighting. And so, by the mid-13th century, less than 100 years after Temujin unified the tribes, the Mongol Empire had become the dominant political and military force across Eurasia. But already the seeds of the empire's eventual decline were being sown. For as Genghis Khan had understood, an empire built on conquest and war can only be held together by continued military success. And once that military success ended, once there were no more territories to conquer, no more enemies to defeat, what would hold the empire together? The strategy of total war. To truly understand how the Mongols conquered such vast territories so quickly, we need to examine not just their military tactics but their overall strategic approach. Genghis Khan and his successors understood something that most medieval rulers did not understand: that war is not something that should be fought according to fixed rules or codes of conduct. That war is a total phenomenon that encompasses not just battle, but logistics, information, psychology, and political strategy. The Mongols didn't just defeat armies. They often didn't even need to directly engage the enemy army. Instead, they would rapidly advance into enemy territory, destroy infrastructure, slaughter civilians, and create terror. Cities that heard about the approaching Mongols would often surrender without a fight, because the psychological impact of Mongol conquest was so devastating. This might seem counterintuitive. Why would Mongols destroy the very territories they were conquering? The answer is strategic. By rapidly destroying resistance and eliminating the possibility of rebellion, the Mongols could consolidate control quickly. They preferred to lose some wealth in conquered cities rather than spend years fighting a prolonged guerrilla war or managing active rebellions. The Mongols also understood the importance of dividing their enemies. They would often send envoys to cities offering surrender terms. If a city agreed to surrender and submit to Mongol rule, the lives of the inhabitants would be spared. If a city refused, the Mongols made clear that the entire population would be killed. This created a powerful incentive for cities to surrender, and it divided opposition. If some cities surrendered while others resisted, the Mongols could focus their forces on the resisting cities, while using the surrendered cities as bases. The speed of Mongol advance was also a psychological weapon. Enemies would often not believe that Mongol armies were approaching until the Mongols were already at their gates. This speed came from the survival system we discussed earlier. The ability to move 80 to 100 miles per day without a supply line. European and Chinese armies, which could move only 15 to 20 miles per day, found themselves constantly surprised by Mongol armies that appeared where they were not expected. A Persian historical source described encountering Mongol armies. They appear on the horizon like a sudden storm. By the time you realize they are there, they are surrounding you. There is no time to organize a defense. There is only the choice to flee or to die. This terror was not accidental. It was strategic. Genghis Khan understood that psychological warfare, creating fear, demonstrating the futility of resistance, was more effective than actually killing everyone. The Mongols also employed a sophisticated system of reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. Before invading a region, Mongol scouts would travel in advance, gathering information about geography, resources, water sources, and potential enemies. This information would be compiled and passed back to Mongol command, allowing for strategic planning before the invasion even began. Additionally, the Mongols were willing to adopt technologies and tactics from the peoples they conquered. When fighting in terrain where cavalry was less effective, they learned to use infantry and siege weapons from Chinese armies. When fighting in mountainous regions, they learned mountain warfare. They were not rigid in their military approach. They adapted to the enemy and to the terrain. The religious dimension of Mongol expansion is also important to understand. Genghis Khan presented his conquest as ordained by Tengri, the sky god of the Mongols. Genghis Khan was not just a military leader. He was a religious figure. This religious justification for conquest made it easier to rally Mongol warriors to fight. It also made it psychologically easier for conquered peoples to submit. If they had been conquered by a divinely ordained ruler, then resistance seemed futile. The organization of the Mongol military was also extremely sophisticated. The basic unit of the Mongol army was the tumen, which consisted of 10,000 warriors. The tumen was divided into smaller units, thousands, hundreds, and tens with clear chains of command. This organization allowed for rapid communication and coordination, even when armies were spread across vast distances. A commander could send orders down the chain, and information could be sent back up. Importantly, Mongol officers were expected to show initiative and adapt to changing circumstances. Unlike many medieval armies where lower officers were expected to simply follow orders, Mongol officers were trained to make decisions based on local conditions. This flexibility made Mongol armies more effective than more rigid military systems. The Mongol strategic approach also included economic considerations. The Mongols understood that controlling trade was important. They protected merchant routes. They ensured that goods could flow across their empire. This created wealth that supported the military system. It also made many merchants and traders actually prefer Mongol rule over previous rule. Trade was more profitable under the Mongols than it had been under previous empires. By the mid-13th century, the Mongol system had proven itself beyond any doubt. Mongol armies had defeated every enemy they faced. They had conquered China, much of the Islamic world, and were threatening Europe. No settled civilization seemed able to resist Mongol military power. The system, the combination of speed, organization, adaptation, psychology, and sustained violence, had been perfected, but success contains the seeds of change. As the Mongol Empire became more settled, as the territories it controlled became more civilized, as Mongol leaders began to rule rather than conquer, the system that had created the empire began to change. And in that change lay the beginning of the end of Mongol dominance. For an empire built on conquest can only survive as long as conquest continues. And when conquest ends, when there are no more territories to conquer, no more enemies to defeat, what happens to the culture of war and hardship that created the warriors who built the empire? What happens when those warriors retire from conquest and settle into palaces? Pause, subscribe, and like our channel for more. Video Story 3, The Fall of the Unstoppable. Why? Comfort destroyed what hardship built. The transition to luxury. By the year 1250, only about 50 years after Genghis Khan unified the tribes and began his conquests, the Mongol Empire had conquered territory that stretched from Korea to the Black Sea. The immediate successors of Genghis Khan, his sons and grandsons, continued the expansions, adding Egypt, most of the Islamic world, and threatening Europe. But something was changing. The sons and grandsons of Genghis Khan were not the men that Genghis Khan had been. They were born into luxury. They were born into imperial palaces. They were born into a world where comfort was available, where power was already established, where conquest was assumed to be their birthright, rather than something they had to fight for. Genghis Khan, for all his brutality and ruthlessness, had lived simply. He had lived on horseback. He had lived in yurts. He had eaten what warriors ate. He had slept where warriors slept. He had understood viscerally what it meant to endure hardship. His successors lived in palaces. They ate the finest foods. They wore silk and jewels. They surrounded themselves with courtiers and administrators. They spent their days in political intrigue and administration rather than in military campaigns. This transition from warrior to ruler is not unique to the Mongols. Many empires have faced this transformation, but for the Mongols, this transition was particularly significant. Because the Mongol system, as we've discussed, was fundamentally built on hardship. The survival skills that made Mongol warriors unstoppable were not skills that were needed in a palace. The discipline that came from surviving on the steppe was not a discipline that palace life demanded. Mongol princes, the children of Mongol generals and administrators, were born into a world of luxury. They did not ride across the steppe hunting for survival. They did not learn to drink horse blood to stay alive. They did not understand on a visceral level what it meant to endure hardship. And as this happened, something began to change in the culture of the Mongol elite. The shared understanding of what it meant to be Mongol, the understanding that had been forged in centuries of steppe survival, began to fragment. Different branches of the Mongol Empire began to develop different cultures, different values, different ways of ruling. The Mongol Empire began to split into regional empires. The Yuan dynasty in China ruled from a palace in Beijing. The Ilkhanate ruled the Islamic territories from Tabriz and later Isfahan. The Golden Horde ruled Russian territories. The Chagatai Khanate ruled Central Asia. These regional empires were still nominally part of the Mongol Empire, but in practice they began to operate independently. Moreover, as Mongol leaders settled into these regional centers, they began to adopt the cultures and religions of the peoples they ruled. The Yuan dynasty adopted Chinese culture and Chinese traditions. The Ilkhans adopted Islamic culture. The Golden Horde adopted Christian and Islamic influences depending on the region. This cultural assimilation had both positive and negative effects. On the positive side, it allowed Mongol rulers to govern more effectively. By adopting local cultures and religions, they reduced resistance and made their rule more acceptable. On the negative side, it diluted the cultural unity of the Mongol Empire, the shared identity that had unified Mongol. Warriors began to dissolve. By the early 14th century, about 100 years after Genghis Khan's death, the Mongol Empire was no longer a unified political entity. It was a loose collection of regional empires that shared a common ancestry, but were increasingly separate in their political interests. The tragedy is not that Mongol leaders adopted local cultures. Cultures naturally blend when empires are established. The tragedy is that in doing so, they lost the cultural values that had made Mongol conquest possible in the first place. The culture of hardship, the discipline of survival, the warrior ethos that had created an army that could conquer the world. A young Mongol prince born in Beijing in the year 1300 was not raised in the traditions of the steppe. He did not ride for days without food. He did not drink horse blood to survive. He did not understand the harsh realities that had created his empire. He was, in every meaningful sense, Chinese, except for his ancestry. And as this cultural transformation progressed, the military effectiveness of Mongol armies began to decline. The soldiers themselves were no longer mostly steppe nomads. They were recruited locally, or they were the descendants of steppe nomads who had been born into settled life. They did not have the survival skills of their ancestors. They did not have the hardened discipline of warriors who had been trained from childhood to endure suffering. Moreover, as Mongol rulers adopted settled ways, they began to rely on settled technologies and settled military practices. They built permanent fortifications. They created administrative bureaucracies. They moved their armies less frequently and covered shorter distances. They became, in many ways, like the very empires they had conquered. The Mongol advantage, the ability to move faster, survive on less, and outmaneuver settled armies, began to disappear. And as this advantage disappeared, the superiority that Mongol armies had enjoyed began to fade. The fracturing empire. The decline of Mongol power in the 14th century was not dramatic. It was not the result of a single catastrophic military defeat. Instead, it was a gradual erosion of power that happened almost imperceptibly, even as observers were watching. In China, the Yuan dynasty, the Mongol rulers of China, faced increasing resistance from the Han Chinese population. The Han Chinese resented Mongol rule, and they resented the fact that Mongols occupied the highest positions in society. Chinese merchants and scholars who had been accustomed to running their own empire chafed under foreign rule. As the 14th century progressed, the Yuan dynasty faced a series of challenges. Floods, famines, and natural disasters created economic hardship. Tax revenues declined. The military became harder to fund. Resentment among the Chinese population grew. In 1368, a Ming general named Zhu Yuanzhang led a rebellion that overthrew the Yuan dynasty. The Mongol rulers were driven north back to the steppe. For the first time since Genghis Khan unified the tribes, the Mongols lost control of a major empire, and once they lost China, the other Mongol regional empires began to crumble as well. The Ilkhanate in the Islamic territories had already fractured into smaller regional powers. The Golden Horde in Russia was fragmenting under pressure from rising Russian principalities. The Chagatai Khanate was losing control of its territories. By the end of the 14th century, the vast Mongol empire that had covered 1/3 of the earth was gone. What is remarkable, and this is the most important point of this story, is that the Mongol Empire was not destroyed by external enemies who were militarily superior. The Yuan dynasty was not overthrown by a foreign army that had superior weapons or tactics. It was overthrown by a Chinese general commanding Chinese troops who could challenge Yuan Mongol authority because the Mongol military machine had declined. The Mongol decline was not caused by anything external. It was caused by the transformation of Mongol society itself. As Mongol leaders became more settled, as they adopted local cultures, as they lost the discipline and hardship that had created them, their military effectiveness declined. And as their military effectiveness declined, they lost control of their empire. This is a crucial lesson in history. An empire built on conquest and military superiority can only maintain that superiority as long as the values and disciplines that created the conquest are maintained. Once those values change, once comfort and luxury replace hardship and discipline, the military machine inevitably declines. The Mongol historians and contemporary observers watched this process with a kind of resigned despair. They understood what was happening, but they could not stop it. A Mongol scholar wrote in the late 14th century, "We have become the peoples we conquered. We dress as they dress. We eat as they eat. We think as they think. We are no longer Mongols in the way our ancestors were Mongols, and in losing our identity we have lost our power." It's important to note that the regional Mongol empires didn't disappear immediately. Some of them lasted well into the 15th or 16th centuries, but their power was fundamentally diminished. They were no longer the dominant forces they had been. They were regional powers, not world conquerors. The legacy of Mongol rule, however, persisted long after Mongol political power ended. The trade networks that the Mongols had established, the Silk Road connections between East and West, continued to function. The cultural exchange that the Mongol Empire had facilitated continued. The technologies that had spread throughout the Mongol Empire, printing, gunpowder, new agricultural techniques, continued to be used. In a sense, the Mongol conquest had been so successful that its consequences outlived the empire itself. The world that the Mongols had created, a more connected, more integrated world, persisted even after Mongol political control ended. But for the Mongols themselves, the decline was complete. They were no longer conquerors. They were a people living on a steppe, watching the civilizations they had once ruled continue to develop and progress. Some Mongol peoples returned to the steppe. Some assimilated into the cultures they had conquered. Some formed new smaller states. But the unified Mongol Empire, the largest land empire in human history, was gone. It had lasted less than 200 years from the time Temujin unified the tribes to the time when that unity completely fractured. The lessons we forgot. What can we learn from the rise and fall of the Mongol Empire? What does this historical story tell us about power, about human nature, about the nature of empires themselves? The first lesson is perhaps the most obvious, that military superiority is temporary. The Mongol armies were the most effective military force of their time. They were better trained, better organized, more mobile, and more disciplined than any other army. But this superiority could not be maintained indefinitely. As the culture that had created this superiority changed, as the values that had sustained it were replaced by new values, the military effectiveness inevitably declined. The second lesson is about the relationship between hardship and achievement. The Mongol Empire was created by a people who had been hardened by centuries of survival in one of the harshest environments on Earth. This hardship created a culture of discipline, of pragmatism, of willingness to endure suffering. These qualities made Mongol warriors effective. But when those warriors were removed from hardship, when their children were born into luxury, the cultural traits that had created effectiveness began to disappear. The third lesson is about the paradox of success. The very thing the Mongols fought to achieve, the conquest of lands, the accumulation of wealth, the ability to build palaces and live in comfort, ultimately destroyed the culture that had made their success possible. As soon as they achieved comfort and settled into civilized life, they lost the qualities that had allowed them to conquer in the first place. This is not unique to the Mongols. Many military empires have faced this same pattern. The Roman Empire, at the height of its power, was a military machine of extraordinary effectiveness. But as Rome became comfortable, as the empire became large and complex, the military culture began to change. The legions became more administrative than military. Veterans were settled in frontier towns where they gradually adopted settled ways. The Roman military effectiveness declined, and this decline contributed to Rome's eventual fall. But the Mongol example is particularly instructive because it happened so quickly. The Rome took centuries to decline. The Mongol Empire took less than 200 years to rise and fall. The speed of the transformation emphasizes how quickly cultural values can change, how quickly the qualities that created success can be lost when success itself removes the conditions that created those qualities. The fourth lesson is about the importance of culture. The Mongol Empire was not held together primarily by military force or political structure. It was held together by a shared culture, a shared understanding of what it meant to be Mongol, of what values mattered, of how one should live. When that shared culture began to dissolve, when Mongols in different regions adopted different local cultures, the unity of the empire dissolved as well. This is an important insight for any organization or society. Military force and political structure are important, but they are not sufficient. There must be a shared culture, a shared identity, a shared set of values. Without that shared culture, organizations fragment and dissolve. The fifth lesson is about the long-term consequences of conquest. The Mongols conquered more territory than any empire before them. They conquered peoples, cities, and civilizations. But in the end, they did not impose their culture on the peoples they conquered. Instead, they were absorbed into the cultures of the peoples they conquered. The Mongol rulers of China became Chinese. The Mongol rulers of Persia became Persian. In cultural terms, the conquest was almost reversed. The conquerors were conquered by the culture of the conquered peoples. This raises a profound question. When an empire conquers a civilization with a stronger culture, who really wins? The Mongols conquered China militarily, but China conquered Mongol culture. Within a few generations, the Mongols were no longer culturally Mongol. They were Chinese with a Mongol ancestry. The sixth lesson is about sustainability. The Mongol conquest was not sustainable. It was maintained by continuous military campaigns, by the momentum of conquest, by the unified leadership of Genghis Khan and his immediate successors. But once conquest stopped, once the frontiers stabilized, the system that had been designed for war and conquest had no purpose. The culture of war could not be maintained in times of peace. This is a lesson for any organization based on a single goal or single achievement. The Mongol system was designed to conquer. It was designed for success in military campaigns. But what do you do when the campaigns end? How do you transform a military machine into a government? The Mongols struggled with this transformation, and in the end they failed. The seventh and perhaps most profound lesson is about human nature. The Mongol warriors were hardened by survival. Their children were born into comfort. Is this inevitable? Must the next generation lose the qualities of the previous generation? Or can cultural values be transmitted across generations? The answer is mixed. Some cultures have successfully maintained their values across centuries. Some cultures have been completely transformed within a generation. The difference seems to be whether the culture remains tied to the conditions that created it. Nomadic pastoral cultures can be maintained across generations because they are tied to the steppe and to the practice of herding. Urban civilizations built on different foundations tend to perpetuate themselves through those urban structures. For the Mongols, the problem was that once they conquered settled civilizations and moved into palaces, the conditions that had created their culture were eliminated. There was no way to maintain the culture of hardship in the context of luxury. There was no way to maintain the warrior ethos in the context of administrative government. The new conditions inevitably created new values. As we reflect on the story of the Mongol Empire, we might ask ourselves, what does this mean for modern civilizations? We live in comfort. We live in the most abundant, most secure civilization in human history. Are we losing the qualities that once made humans and human societies effective? Are we becoming soft in the way that the Mongol elite became soft? And if so, what are the consequences? These are questions that go beyond the scope of this historical narrative, but they are questions that the Mongol story invites us to consider. History is not just about understanding the past. It is about understanding ourselves, about recognizing in the patterns of history our own potential futures. The Mongols conquered the world through extraordinary hardship, discipline, and the will to endure. They built an empire that was briefly the largest the world had ever seen. But that very success, the achievement of comfort and luxury, transformed them into something different. And in that transformation, they lost the power that had created their empire. Perhaps the deepest lesson of the Mongol story is that power is not something that can be possessed and then held on to indefinitely. Power must be constantly renewed. Power must be based on qualities that are continuously regenerated. Once those qualities disappear, power inevitably disappears with them. For the Mongols, their power was based on hardship, discipline, and an extraordinary will to survive. Remove those qualities and the power was gone. The empire that seemed so unstoppable, the empire that in 1206 seemed destined to rule the world forever, was gone within 200 years. And in their disappearance, they left us a warning, a lesson, and a mirror in which we might perhaps see ourselves. Please subscribe and like our channel for more videos.